Hi friends, glad to be back today. And today I want to talk about the relationship with the codependent and the person that exhibits borderline traits and how that interacts. Especially, we've already gone through the pedestal stage with the codependent has felt very comfortable, very happy that they are getting attention from the borderline. They don't even realize what's really happening. They just think for the first time somebody actually cares about all the things that they do and all the doting they're doing on this person and all the responsibilities that they're shrugging to be with this person. And all these things are happening. It's this whirlwind kind of romance because it almost feels perfect, right? But remember, nothing's really ever perfect. But again, the borderline is literally loving almost everything that the codependent's doing. The codependent is eating it up, doesn't realize that they're on a pedestal. They just think that this is true love. And the borderline doesn't even realize they're putting them on a pedestal because they don't realize that they're seeing them as perfection right now. And then eventually, as that perfection begins to whittle away, and the borderline begins to see the codependent as not being perfect, that's when we start having these arguments. That's when the nitpicking begins. That's when the comments start, the pinpricks, all these little different things begin to happen. And the codependent doesn't get it. And remember, the codependent is very fragile as well. So these little pinpricks that are done by the person exhibiting the BPD tendencies, that's happening, and the pinpricks are actually hurting the codependent. The codependent is getting angry and angrier, more resentful and resentful. But then they're wondering why this is happening. Like almost to a point where they want to just act like it's not happening because the codependent doesn't want to believe that this is really happening. They kind of want to sweep it under the rug. Now think about it, because a lot of times, remember, most codependents do not like confrontation. Confrontation is not something you like because you want to keep everybody harmonious and happy and everything's great, we're perfect, and this is wonderful, because they don't want to deal with it. Because remember, look back at most of us who are in recovery from codependency or still codependent. When you look back at your childhood, you realize you were the one that tried to keep everything together. You were the one that was trying to help everybody, smooth things over, not rock the boat. And so you're ultimately going to, like, maybe a pinprick, you let it go. You don't say anything. Maybe you laugh about it. Maybe you change the subject, or you do something else for the person thinking, okay, well, we're going to get back to wherever we were. Now, the codependent doesn't realize that they were on a pedestal at all. That's not even part of the thought process, right? And the borderline doesn't realize that they put them on a pedestal either, because that's just the way that they operate. Not that they're doing it on purpose to throw someone off the pedestal. It's just they began the relationship seeing this person as perfect, and now they're starting to not see that perfection. But there's also no gray area with the person that exhibits BPD. Remember, there's no like gray area. Well, John's not perfect. He did this wrong, but he's still very cool about this, this, and this. And no, it's like you do something wrong, usually it's very black and white. John's now an ass, okay? Something's wrong with him completely. And so all of a sudden, John has to pull himself out of this hole to try to make himself back to where he was. And you can do it and get back on the pedestal, but there's a lot of groveling, there's a lot of work, and there's a lot of giving and little taking when you're in that position. And so it's very interesting when I find clients who they say, we keep getting these arguments. I don't know how to change things. Like, what do I do next? I've done this. We've gone on a trip. I've taken off work. I've done exactly what's needed, but it's not enough. And so that's where the problem lies. Is the codependent keeps trying to give and give and give till it hurts, but it's not going to be enough because there's a void that needs to be filled with the person that's exhibiting BPD tendencies. And that void is not going to be filled by the things that the codependent's doing, right? But the codependent doesn't realize that. And the codependent also doesn't realize that they need to be doing things for themselves that they're not doing, because it's easier to do for the other person. And it's easier to see the other person's needs than it is to see their own. And you see, it's a perfect storm again. The perfect storm is right here because the codependent does not want to look at themselves and their own issues, and they would rather look outside of themselves and help the other person. So it's a very interesting ballet that we see with this couple, because it literally is like puzzle pieces, but they're not logically fitting together, but they're being forced to fit together because of the needs of each person, right? And neither one can fill the other person's voids. And it's very interesting too, because the borderline has a tendency of being overly emotional, right? It's very hard for them to regulate emotion. And so they're going through their headspace on a daily basis, thinking about all these things that's in their head, and they're trying to calm themselves down. They don't have the bandwidth to understand where the codependent's coming from. They don't have the bandwidth to process the codependent's feelings, right? And so the codependent eventually starts feeling alone and desperate because the borderline is not there. And so eventually the borderline keeps asking for more and more things, asking the codependent to jump through more and more hoops. That's the codependent's way of life, right? I'm going to jump through all these hoops because I had to do it my whole life. I'm going to keep doing it. But it's interesting how in the beginning they don't really see it. And it's almost like the codependent becomes forgetful because they don't remember the fights that happened yesterday. They keep trying to remember the best of the best of the best. And that's why the previous video that I did on this was the beginning of the relationship. And that beginning of the relationship, that fairy tale piece, is what the codependent keeps thinking about as they're walking through these tunnels, these issues of being off the pedestal, getting back on, getting back off sort of thing. And so they keep going back to the beginning of the relationship and focusing super bird dog focusing on it. And while they're doing that, they're not really paying attention to what's happening right now. Okay, and it gives them the fuel to keep in the relationship. It gives them the fuel to go, okay, I can do this. I'm going to give more. I'm going to do this, even though it's things that they would never do in any other relationship, but they're going to do now. And the interesting part is that the borderline is really unhappy anyway. So they're unhappy. They are not happy. And so that unhappiness is shown a lot of times in the situation. I'm not saying that we're always unhappy. That's not what I'm saying about every borderline. Please don't take that out of context. But I'm saying in the situation, when the person with BPD is acting out or doing certain things, they are unhappy. They are unhappy in their own life. They're unhappy with their own self in that moment, right? And so they don't have the ability to be happy and to turn it on and, oh, I'm great, I'm fine, I'm wonderful. And so usually the codependent sees that as them getting even angrier with them, right? And then the codependent wants to soothe and calm. But in the process of soothing and calming, the codependent begins to lose their own identity even more because they are actually repressing their own feelings of anger and angst and resentment at the same time. And so all this is happening in the middle of the dynamic. But remember, the codependent keeps going because that's the codependent way of life. The person with BPD tendencies, that's the way that they've always done things. Remember, there's always that pedestal. They don't really realize that either. There's always this black and white thinking, which they don't always realize that either. They don't see that usually. Maybe there's lucidity and points where they go, oh man, I am acting that way, or I am doing that. But it comes second nature with both types of people here. And so that second nature is what's really the guiding force in this relationship. And until we become really self-aware into what we're doing, because we can become very self-aware. Whether you're codependent or you're exhibiting signs of BPD, you can be self-aware. And once you begin to see and be self-aware, you can actually look at past relationships as well and see what happened in that relationship. What happened in that previous relationship? What was that about? What did I bring into that relationship? What did I add into this relationship? Why am I feeling this way? And are some of these situations similar to previous relationships? I don't think anything is not treatable or helpable. I think everything can be that as long as we're self-aware. But looking at that dynamic and realizing that is the perfect storm. Now, I mean, we can talk about the narcissist and the borderline. We can talk about the differences, and we'll do that in upcoming videos because that's a whole different dynamic. It's super different. And the interactions are different. Now, remember, last thing I want to bring up in this particular video is different from the narcissist. The codependent is giving till it hurts, right? And they're focusing on the borderline before they focus on themselves, okay? In the beginning, that was awesome, but eventually that's not enough for the borderline. And there's not enough work, there's not enough time, there's not enough energy, there's not enough focus for the borderline. So eventually the borderline wants more and more and more. The opposite of the narcissist, which would not give hardly any time to the borderline, and the borderline would want any crumb they could get from the narcissist. So it's a very different dynamic. And so again, the codependent feels like they're giving and they begin to feel empty. And that's when the problem begins in the relationship, because all of a sudden the codependent's at a crossroads. What do? I don't feel like I'm happy or sustained in this relationship. I'm not getting any joy out of it, but I'm so used to it because it's so commonplace, because this is what I'm used to. And remember, the borderline is also having issues because they no longer see this person as perfect. Like right now, usually they've already painted them a certain level, thinking, this person's, I can't even believe I'm in this relationship. What am I doing? And then there's that fear of relationships too. There's anxiety. There's a fear of being alone. And in that process of the fear of being alone or fear of being abandoned, they stay in that relationship even though they might not be happy in the relationship. And then the codependent's trying to make them happy. And so we have this vicious cycle. I work with clients on a daily basis about this exact concept, dealing with these exact situations and how to manage it, understand it, and understand where it's coming from us. Because we're operating from a system, a program, and we're operating from that system. And sometimes that system needs to be augmented. Sometimes that system needs to be completely wiped clean and changed so that we can begin to live the life that we actually want to live, not based on programming of how we had to deal within the family dynamic, or not based on genetic programming as well. So all these things can be augmented as long as we're self-aware and we begin to see our tendencies, and then we begin to understand why we do what we do. And then that's what begins to change everything. I also have a master class, by the way, of living with somebody with BPD. And this master class are video modules that you can easily watch from your office or on your iPad, or even working out, you can watch it. And it just goes through step-by-step process of how to understand the situation, why the other person is saying certain things or acting certain ways, what the pathology is, what they're thinking, what you're doing, and then how to shift that. Because if we can shift that, we can make major change in our life. If we can shift that, we might be able to save the relationship. If we can shift that, we will also learn so much about ourselves. Not only them, but ourselves in the process. I hope that this video has helped you. If you haven't already, please subscribe to my channel. It makes me know that I'm doing something right. And I realize that you actually like the content when you subscribe. And it means a lot to us. Also, if you have a chance, please give us a like on this video, a thumbs up, and that'll also help us to know that this content connected with you. In the comment section, let me know. I mean, have you been on one side or the other in this situation? And what side are you identifying with? It's very interesting because I think that a lot of us are dealing with this exact specific situation, and sometimes we don't know exactly what we're dealing with, but I'm hoping that this video can help you put a finger on it, a finger on the pulse, to understand not only your significant other better, but also yourself. Don't forget to live your true life.